England, 1829. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Ashworth Manor like a shroud of memory, wrapping itself around ancient oaks and weathered stone with the same persistence that certain emotions wrap themselves around the human heart. Maximilian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, stood at the window of his study, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey light of dawn, watching as a carriage made its slow progress up the long drive. He had been standing there for the better part of an hour, though he would admit such weakness to no living soul. 5 years had passed since he last saw her. 5 years, 2 months, and 14 days to be precise, though he did not allow himself to count the hours. A gentleman of his position and reputation did not indulge in such folly. The Duke of Ravenscroft was known throughout England for his cool composure, his impeccable judgment, and his absolute mastery over every aspect of his considerable domain. He had built that reputation with deliberate care, brick by brick, decision by decision, until the facade had become so complete that even he sometimes forgot it was merely that, a facade. The carriage drew closer, and Maximilian felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced since the day he watched this same woman marry his brother. He forced his hands to remain steady, his breathing to remain measured. Control was everything. Control was all he had. Elizabeth. Even thinking her name felt like a transgression, though she had been family, his sister-in-law, for 6 years before widowhood claimed her. Before fate, in its cruel arithmetic, had taken Dominique from this world and left Maximilian to face the one truth he had spent a decade trying to bury, that he loved his brother's wife with an intensity that terrified him. The carriage stopped at the main entrance, and Maximilian stepped back from the window, though he did not look away. He watched as a footman opened the door and extended his hand. A gloved hand emerged first, small and elegant, followed by the rustle of black morning dress. Then she stepped down, and even from this distance, even through the morning mist and the 5 years that separated them, Maximilian felt the same shock of recognition that had struck him the first time he saw her. She had been 18 then, newly arrived from her father's modest estate in Cornwall, brought to London for her first season by an ambitious aunt. Maximilian had been 32, already duke for 10 years following his father's death, already hardened by responsibility and isolation into something that might have been mistaken for marble were it not for the warmth he took such pains to conceal. He had attended the Pemberton ball that spring evening with no expectations beyond fulfilling a social obligation. The season had become a tedious parade of ambitious mothers and their calculating daughters, women who saw not a man but a title, a fortune, a means to elevation. Maximilian had perfected the art of polite distance, of being present in body while remaining utterly absent in spirit. And then he had seen her. She had been standing near the terrace doors, slightly apart from the crowd, her attention fixed on something beyond the glass, the garden, perhaps, or simply the escape it represented. The candlelight caught the gold in her hair, which she wore in a simpler style than fashion dictated, and there was something in her posture, a quality of stillness amid the chaos of the ballroom, that drew his eye like a sailor to a lighthouse. When she turned and their eyes met across the crowded room, Maximilian experienced something he had not felt since boyhood, complete and utter helplessness. It was as though every defense he had constructed, every wall he had built around his heart simply ceased to exist. In that moment, he was merely a man, and she was merely a woman, and the space between them seemed both infinite and non-existent. He had crossed that space without conscious decision, his feet carrying him through the crowd with a determination that would have alarmed him had he been capable of alarm. He had been capable of nothing save the need to know her name, to hear her voice, to discover if the connection he felt was real or merely the fantasy of a man too long alone. Miss Hartwell, her aunt had introduced her, and Elizabeth had curtsied with practiced grace, though her eyes held a spark of something beyond mere social polish, intelligence perhaps, or the kind of quiet rebellion that comes from a spirit too large for its circumstances. "Oh, Your Grace," she had murmured, and her voice had been everything he had not known he was waiting to hear, warm and clear, with a hint of music in it, as though she might at any moment laugh or sing. They had danced. He had claimed her hand for the waltz, breaking his own rule against displaying preference, and as he led her onto the floor, he had felt the eyes of society upon them, noting, calculating, already composing the gossip that would fill tomorrow's drawing rooms. He had not cared. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Maximilian Ashworth had not cared what anyone thought. "You do not enjoy these gatherings, Miss Hartwell," he had said as they began to move through the figures of the dance. It was not a question. She had looked up at him, surprise flickering across her delicate features. "How did you discern such a thing, Your Grace?" "You were watching the garden as though it were a sanctuary," he replied. "I recognize the sentiment." A smile had touched her lips then. A real smile, not the practiced expression young ladies deployed like weapons in the marriage market. "I confess I find these events somewhat overwhelming. So many people, all working so very hard to appear other than they are. And you prefer authenticity. Does that make me terribly provincial?" "It makes you rare," he had said, and meant it. They had talked throughout the dance, and Maximilian had found himself saying things he had never said to anyone, revealing parts of himself he had thought sealed away forever. She had a way of listening that made confession feel not like weakness, but like gift. And when the music ended, he had not wanted to release her hand. "Might I call upon you, Miss Hartwell?" he had asked, propriety warring with desire in his tone. But before she could answer, Dominique had appeared at her elbow, flushed with champagne and high spirits, his handsome face alight with the careless joy that was his birthright as the spare rather than the heir. "I say, Max, are you going to monopolize this vision all evening?" Dominique had laughed, already reaching for Elizabeth's hand. "Miss Hartwell, your aunt has promised me the next set. I do hope my fearsome brother hasn't frightened you into a decline." Elizabeth had looked between them, confusion in her eyes, and Maximilian had felt the first cold finger of foreboding touch his spine. "Miss Hartwell, may I present my younger brother, Lord Dominique Ashworth," he had said, his voice perfectly level, betraying nothing of the sudden dread that filled him. Dominique had bowed with his characteristic flourish, all charm and golden beauty, his eyes already fixed on Elizabeth with an admiration he made no effort to conceal. "A pleasure beyond measure, Miss Hartwell. Though I must protest my brother's description, I am merely younger, not fearsome, and I dance considerably better. Come, let me prove it." He had swept her away before Maximilian could object, and the Duke had been left standing at the edge of the ballroom, watching his brother spin the woman he loved through the crowd. Even then, so early, he had known what was coming. Dominique had always been drawn to beauty like a moth to flame, and Elizabeth was more than beautiful. She was luminous. Over the following weeks, Maximilian had watched with growing resignation as his brother courted Elizabeth with single-minded devotion. Dominique had called upon her daily, sent flowers in quantities that bordered on absurd, composed terrible poetry that somehow charmed rather than repelled, and generally conducted himself with the sort of passionate intensity that Maximilian could never permit himself. And Elizabeth, barely 18 and new to London, had been swept away by it all. How could she not be? Dominique offered everything that Maximilian, in his careful control, could not: spontaneity, laughter, the promise of a life lived in joy rather than duty. Maximilian had told himself he was being rational. He was the Duke. Marriage for him was a matter of alliance and obligation, not emotion. Dominique, as the younger son, could afford to marry for love. It was better this way, practical, sensible. He had repeated these lies to himself, even as he gave his blessing to their engagement, even as he made the arrangements for the wedding to be held at Ashworth Manor, even as he stood as witness, while his brother pledged himself to the only woman Maximilian had ever loved. On the wedding day, Elizabeth had smiled at Dominique with such happiness that Maximilian had felt something inside him crack. He had raised his glass at the wedding breakfast and offered a toast to the happy couple, his voice steady, his expression serene, while inside he bled. That night, he had locked himself in his study with a bottle of brandy and faced the truth he could no longer deny. He loved Elizabeth Hartwell with a completeness that made a mockery of duty and control, and she would never be his. The years that followed had been an exquisite torture. Elizabeth and Dominique had made their home in the east wing of Ashworth Manor. close enough that Maximilian saw her daily, heard her laughter in the corridors, watched her transform from a girl into a woman. He had perfected the role of concerned elder brother, had played the part so well that he almost convinced himself it was real. Almost. There had been moments when the mask had nearly slipped. Afternoons when he found her reading in the library, and they fell into conversation, the words flowing between them with the same ease they had shared that first night. Mornings when he encountered her in the garden, and she asked his opinion on the roses, her face up-tilted to his, sunlight gilding her skin. Evenings when they sat across from each other at dinner, and their eyes met over the candles, and for just an instant, he saw something in her gaze that made him wonder. But he never acted on those moments, never allowed himself to do more than imagine what might have been. She was Dominique's wife, and that made her sacrosanct. Dominique, for his part, had seemed happy. His natural exuberance had been somewhat tempered by marriage, but he remained devoted to Elizabeth, showering her with affection and attention. If there were moments when Maximilian glimpsed shadows in his brother's eyes, if there were times when Dominique's gaiety seemed forced, the Duke attributed it to the normal adjustments of married life. Then had come that terrible morning 5 years ago when a groom arrived at the manor, his horse lathered and his face white, bearing news that would shatter everything. Dominique's curricle had overturned on the road from Brighton. The horses had bolted. It had been instantaneous. Maximilian had gone to Elizabeth himself to deliver the news. He had found her in the morning room, working on her embroidery, the sunlight streaming through the windows and turning her hair to gold. When he told her, she had simply stopped, the needle frozen in mid-air, her face draining of all color. "No," she had whispered. "No, that cannot be. We were to go to the theatre next week. He promised. He promised." Then she had collapsed, and Maximilian had caught her, had held her while she shattered against him, her grief so raw and terrible that it had nearly undone him. For the first and only time, he had allowed himself to hold her, to smooth her hair, to whisper useless words of comfort against her temple. The funeral had been a nightmare of propriety and ritual. Elizabeth had stood beside Maximilian in her widow's weeds, a figure of such pale, perfect sorrow that she seemed carved from moonlight. She had not wept during the service, had maintained a composure that rivaled his own, and only he had noticed the way her hands trembled, the way she swayed slightly when they lowered the coffin into the ground. Afterward, she had stayed at Ashworth Manor for the period of deep mourning, but the joy had gone out of the place. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, speaking only when necessary, eating little, sleeping less. Maximilian had done what he could, ensuring she was cared for, respecting her grief, maintaining the distance that propriety demanded. 6 months after Dominique's death, Elizabeth had informed him of her intention to retire to the dower house on her father's estate in Cornwall. She needed, she said, to be away from memories, to find some measure of peace. Maximilian had not argued, though the thought of her leaving had felt like a second death. On the day of her departure, he had stood in this same study, at this same window, and watched her carriage disappear down the drive. She had not looked back. 5 years of silence had followed. Elizabeth had written occasionally, brief notes acknowledging holidays and important dates, always perfectly polite and utterly impersonal. Maximilian had responded in kind, maintaining the fiction that she was simply a distant relation, someone for whom he felt only familial concern. And now she was returning. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, her handwriting still as elegant as he remembered, informing him that she would be concluding her mourning and accepting his long-standing invitation to visit Ashworth Manor. Something about estate business that required his attention, matters pertaining to the settlement Dominique had established for her. Maximilian had read the letter a dozen times, searching for meaning between the lines, finding none. She was coming because practicality demanded it, nothing more. He would receive her with perfect courtesy, attend to whatever business required attention, and send her on her way. It would be perfectly civilized. He had believed this right up until the moment he saw her step from the carriage. She had changed. The girl who had left 5 years ago had become a woman in truth. The girlish roundness had refined into elegant lines, and there was something in the way she carried herself now, a quality of self-possession that had not been there before. The widow's weeds suited her in a way that made Maximilian's chest tighten. She wore mourning like a queen, all dignity and grace, but it was her face that stopped his breath. Time had not diminished her beauty. If anything, she was more striking now than she had been at 18. But there was a sadness in her eyes that had not been there before. A shadow that spoke of grief endured in solitude, and Maximilian found himself wanting to erase it with an intensity that bordered on violence. She looked up at the house, her gaze moving across the familiar facade, and even from this distance Maximilian could see the emotion that crossed her features. Loss, memory, something that might have been longing. Then her eyes lifted to his study window, and for one suspended moment they looked directly at each other. Maximilian did not move, could not move. The world had narrowed to this single point of connection, this meeting of eyes across distance, and he felt every defense he had spent 5 years rebuilding simply crumble to dust. Then Elizabeth looked away, turning to speak to her maid, and the moment broke. Maximilian forced himself to move, to descend the stairs with measured steps, to arrive in the entrance hall just as Henderson, the butler, was greeting their guest. "Your Grace," Henderson was saying, "we are delighted to welcome you back to Ashworth Manor." "Thank you, Henderson," Elizabeth replied, and the sound of her voice, unchanged, still holding that hint of music, sent a shock through Maximilian's system. "It is strange to be here again. Lady Elizabeth." She turned at the sound of his voice, and Maximilian watched color flood her cheeks, watched her hands clasped together at her waist in a gesture he remembered from years ago when she was nervous. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, though the movement seemed to cost her effort. "Thank you for your hospitality." "You are family," he replied, the formal words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Ashworth Manor is yours as much as it is mine." Something flickered in her eyes at that, pain perhaps, or memory. "That is kind of you to say, though we both know it is not precisely true." They stood looking at each other across the marble floor of the entrance hall, years and loss and unspoken words stretching between them like a physical presence. Maximilian was aware of Henderson and the footman watching, waiting, the whole household holding its collective breath at this reunion. "You must be fatigued from your journey," he said, falling back on the safety of protocol. "Henderson will show you to your rooms. I have had the rose suite prepared. It has always received the afternoon light you favor." "You remembered," she said softly, and something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "I remember everything," he said, then cursed himself for the admission. Color rose in her cheeks again, and she looked away. "I should like to rest before dinner, if that would not be inconvenient." "Of course. We dine at 8, but please do not feel obligated to join me if you would prefer a tray in your room." "No," she said quickly, then seemed to catch herself. "That is, I would not wish to be rude. I shall join you for dinner." "Very well," he inclined his head. "Until this evening, then." She curtsied again and followed Henderson up the stairs, her maid trailing behind with a small valise. Maximilian stood watching until she disappeared around the landing, then turned and walked back to his study with careful, measured steps. Only when he was safely behind the closed door did he allow himself to lean against it, eyes closed, breathing like a man who had just run a great distance. She was here. Elizabeth was here, under his roof, and every feeling he had tried to bury was roaring back to life with a force that threatened to undo him. This was going to be harder than he had imagined. Elizabeth stood in the center of the rose suite and tried to remember how to breathe. 5 years. She had prepared herself for this moment for 5 years, had rehearsed what she would say, how she would act. She had convinced herself that time and distance had done their work, that she was ready to face him with perfect composure. She had been wrong. One look at Maximilian Ashworth, and she had felt 18 again, standing in a ballroom caught in the gaze of a man who seemed to see straight into her soul. If anything, he had become more imposing with age. At 37, he was in the prime of manhood, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his features sharper, more austere. He wore authority like a second skin, and there was a quality of isolation about him that made her heart ache. But his eyes, those grey eyes that had haunted her dreams, were unchanged, and in them, for just a moment when he said he remembered everything, she had seen something that made her pulse quicken. "Shall I unpack your things, my lady?" Agnes, her maid, asked tentatively. Elizabeth turned away from her contemplation of the room. Yes, thank you, Agnes. Just the necessities for now. We will not be staying long. As you say, my lady. Agnes bustled about with the efficiency of long practice, while Elizabeth moved to the window. The rose suite overlooked the gardens, and the view was exactly as she remembered. The late spring flowers were in full bloom, creating a riot of color against the manicured lawns. In the distance she could see the ornamental lake where she and Dominique had often walked, where he had first kissed her on an autumn evening 6 years ago. Strange, how that memory brought only a gentle melancholy now, rather than the sharp pain that had characterized the first years of her widowhood. Time had indeed done its work on her grief, had transformed it from an open wound into a scar that ached only occasionally, but it had done nothing to diminish her feelings for Maximilian. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. This was her great secret, the truth she had carried alone for 6 years. She had married the wrong brother. She had not known it at first. Dominique had been everything a young girl could want, handsome, charming, attentive. He had made her laugh, had written her poetry, had promised her a life of joy and adventure, and she had convinced herself that what she felt for Maximilian was merely the admiration any young woman would feel for a powerful, attractive man. Infatuation, nothing more. It was only after the wedding, after she became part of the household at Ashworth Manor, that she began to understand the truth. Dominique loved her, she did not doubt that. But his love was like summer lightning, bright, spectacular, and ultimately fleeting. He adored her in company, grew bored with her in private. He wanted the idea of a wife, the possession of a beautiful woman, but he had little interest in the person she actually was. Maximilian, on the other hand, had known her from that first meeting. When they talked, and they talked often during those years before Dominique's death, she felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. He asked her opinions on matters of estate management, discussed books and politics and philosophy with her as though her thoughts mattered. He noticed small things, when she was tired, when she was troubled, when she needed silence rather than conversation. And slowly, inexorably, Elizabeth had fallen in love with her husband's brother. She had hidden it, of course, hidden it from Dominique, from the household, from herself whenever possible. She had been a dutiful wife, had smiled and played her role, and had told herself that these feelings would fade. Then Dominique had died, and everything had become impossibly complicated. His death had devastated her, not least because of the guilt that came with it. In those terrible weeks after the accident, lying alone in her darkened room, she had tortured herself with questions. Had Dominique known? Had he sensed her divided heart? Was that why he had seemed so restless in those final months, so quick to find excuses to be away from Ashworth Manor? She had fled to Cornwall not just to mourn, but to escape the impossible situation of being in love with her dead husband's brother. 5 years of exile, 5 years of trying to forget, of convincing herself that what she felt was simply a widow's fantasy, a way of avoiding the reality of her loss. And now, standing in this room where she had spent so many sleepless nights, thinking of the man who lived in the opposite wing of the house, she knew that nothing had changed. If anything, what she felt was stronger, sharpened by absence, into something that felt less like affection and more like necessity. This was madness. She should have stayed in Cornwall, should have found some way to handle the estate business through correspondence. Coming here had been a mistake. But even as she thought it, Elizabeth knew she would not leave, could not leave, not yet, not until she understood whether what she had glimpsed in Maximilian's eyes was real or simply her own desperate hope reflected back at her. "Your bath is ready, my lady," Agnes announced. Elizabeth turned from the window. "Thank you, Agnes. I believe I shall rest after I bathe. Please wake me an hour before dinner." She needed to gather her strength, needed to prepare herself to sit across from Maximilian Ashworth and pretend that her heart was not threatening to pound out of her chest at the mere thought of him. It was going to be a very long evening. Dinner was a study in careful formality. Maximilian sat at the head of the long dining table, Elizabeth to his right in the position of honor. The distance between them was perhaps 3 feet, but it might as well have been miles for all the warmth the setting provided. Footmen moved silently through the room, serving course after course of exquisitely prepared food that Maximilian barely tasted. Elizabeth had changed into a dinner dress of dark grey silk, still morning colours, but a shade lighter than the black she had worn for travelling. The dress was cut in the latest style, though not ostentatiously so, and it showed to advantage the elegant lines of her figure. She wore no jewellery save a simple strand of pearls, her only adornment, and she needed none other. "I trust you found your rooms comfortable?" Maximilian asked, breaking a silence that had stretched too long. "Very comfortable, thank you," Elizabeth replied, her eyes fixed on her plate. "Nothing has changed. I find that people often desire consistency in times of transition." She looked up at that, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since they had sat down. "Is that why you have kept everything exactly as it was? For my sake?" The question caught him off guard. He had indeed instructed the household to maintain the East Wing just as it had been when she lived there, had even preserved her personal sitting room, though he could not have explained to himself why. "I saw no reason to change what was already perfect," he said carefully. Something shifted in her expression, pain perhaps, or a flash of some other emotion he could not name. She looked away again, reaching for her wine glass. "You mentioned in your letter that there were matters pertaining to Dominique's settlement that required attention," Maximilian continued, steering the conversation to safer ground. "Yes," Elizabeth said, seeming grateful for the change of subject. "My man of business has raised some questions about the investments that were made on my behalf. I confess, I do not understand the complexities involved, and I hoped you might review the documents and advise me." "Of course. I would be happy to assist. We can review everything in my study tomorrow if that would suit." "That would be most helpful, thank you." Another silence fell, broken only by the clink of silverware against china. Maximilian searched for something to say, some topic that would bridge this awful distance between them, but every subject seemed fraught with danger. He could not ask about her life in Cornwall without risking painful memories, could not speak of the manor without referencing Dominique, could not discuss his own affairs without revealing how empty his life had been these past 5 years. "Have you been well, Your Grace?" Elizabeth asked suddenly, and there was something in her tone that made him look at her sharply. "Quite well, thank you." "Forgive me, but you seem tired. Have you been working very hard?" He was tired, exhausted in fact. The past weeks, knowing she was coming, he had thrown himself into estate business with an intensity that bordered on obsession, trying to outrun the anticipation that threatened to consume him. "The duchy requires constant attention," he said with a dismissive gesture. "Yes, but surely even dukes require rest. Dominique used to say—" She stopped abruptly, her hand going to her throat, as though to stop the words. "It is all right," Maximilian said quietly. "You need not avoid speaking of him on my account. I do not wish to cause you pain." "The pain is there regardless," he replied, and was surprised to find it was true. He had loved his brother, despite everything. "Speaking of Dominique does not create grief, Elizabeth. It merely acknowledges what already exists." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw tears glisten in her eyes, though she did not allow them to fall. "He was lucky to have you as a brother," she said softly. "You gave him everything." Not everything, Maximilian thought. "I kept one thing for myself, even if I could never claim it." "He was my brother," Maximilian said instead. "I would have done anything for him." "I know." She reached for her napkin, dabbing at her eyes. "Forgive me. I had thought I was past these sudden moments of emotion. There is nothing to forgive. Grief is not a linear progression. You speak as one familiar with it." "I have had my share of losses," he said, thinking not just of Dominique but of her, of the life they might have had if fate had been kinder. The footmen served the next course, and they ate in silence for several minutes. Then Elizabeth spoke again, her voice determinedly lighter. "Tell me what has been happening in society. I have been quite removed from such matters in Cornwall, and I confess I am curious about what I have missed." Maximilian allowed the change of subject, and they passed the remainder of the meal in discussing the safer topics of politics and social gossip. He told her about the controversies in Parliament, the scandals that had rocked the ton, the marriages and births and deaths that marked the passage of time among their class. She listened attentively, asking intelligent questions, and gradually the awful formality that had marked the beginning of the meal eased into something closer to their old rapport. By the time the dessert course arrived, they were almost comfortable with each other, the conversation flowing with something approaching the ease they had once shared. It was dangerous, this comfort. Dangerous because it reminded Maximilian of all the reasons he had fallen in love with her, because it made him forget for moments at a time that she was forbidden to him, that she had been his brother's wife, and could never be anything more to him. When dinner concluded, Elizabeth rose and Maximilian stood immediately. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Your Grace," she said formally. "The pleasure was mine, Lady Elizabeth." She curtsied, but as she straightened, their eyes met, and Maximilian saw something in her gaze that made his breath catch. It was there only for an instant, a flash of longing so intense it seemed to illuminate the space between them. And then it was gone, shuttered away behind the careful composure she wore like armor. "Good night," she whispered, and fled the dining room before he could respond. Maximilian stood staring at the empty doorway long after she had gone, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He had not imagined it. That look, that moment, she had felt it too, this connection that defied propriety and reason. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Nothing, he told himself firmly. He would do nothing. She was his brother's widow, and that made her sacred. He would help her with her estate business, would be courteous and hospitable, and would send her back to Cornwall with his conscience intact. But even as he formed these resolutions, Maximilian knew they were lies. Something had shifted tonight, some carefully maintained distance had collapsed, and he suspected that neither of them would emerge from her visit unchanged. He poured himself a generous measure of brandy and retired to his study, knowing that sleep would not come easily this night. The next morning dawned clear and bright, promising one of those perfect late spring days that made England seem like paradise. Elizabeth woke early, her sleep having been troubled by dreams she could not quite recall upon waking, though they left her with a lingering sense of loss and longing. She dressed in a simple day dress of dove grey and descended to the breakfast room, hoping for a few moments of solitude before facing Maximilian again. But when she entered, she found him already there, standing by the sideboard with a cup of coffee in his hand. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and Elizabeth saw surprise flicker across his features. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not mean to intrude upon your morning routine." "You are not intruding," he replied, setting down his cup. "I am pleased to have your company. Please, help yourself to whatever you wish." They moved through the ritual of assembling breakfast plates with careful attention to not touching, not standing too close, though the awareness between them was palpable. Elizabeth selected toast and preserves, while Maximilian resumed his position by the window, looking out at the gardens. "I thought perhaps we might review those documents after breakfast," he said, "unless you would prefer to wait until later in the day." "No, this morning would be perfect," Elizabeth replied, taking her seat at the table. "I confess I am anxious to understand the situation fully." "Anxious in what way?" She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My man of business believes that some of the investments made on my behalf were perhaps too conservative. He feels I could be receiving better returns." Maximilian frowned. "The investments were made according to Dominique's wishes, as expressed in the settlement he created at the time of your marriage." "Yes, but perhaps circumstances have changed. Perhaps there are opportunities now that did not exist then." He turned to look at her fully, and Elizabeth felt the weight of his regard like a physical touch. "You wish to take greater risks with your capital." "I wish to have the means to live independently," she said quietly. "The income from the settlement is adequate, but barely so. If I wish to maintain my own establishment, to have any sort of life beyond mere subsistence, I need to be more aggressive in my investments." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You do not wish to live at your father's estate. My father is a dear man, but his house is small and his circumstances modest. I cannot burden him indefinitely with my presence." "You are not a burden." "Please," she interrupted. "I know what I am. A childless widow with a modest income and no prospects. I impose upon his hospitality, and while he would never say so, I know it is a strain." Maximilian set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "If your circumstances are difficult, you have only to say so. As Dominique's brother, it is my responsibility to ensure you are cared for." "I do not want charity," Elizabeth said, her voice sharper than she intended. "It would not be charity. It would be family obligation. I am not family, not truly." The words came out before she could stop them, and she saw him flinch as though she had struck him. "You were my brother's wife," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "That makes you family in every way that matters." Was it her imagination, or was there some emphasis on the word brothers? Some subtle stress that suggested he wished circumstances were otherwise? "Forgive me," Elizabeth said, looking down at her plate. "I did not mean to sound ungrateful. Your generosity is more than I deserve." "You deserve far more than I have given you," he said quietly, and when she looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. They stared at each other across the breakfast table, and Elizabeth felt the air between them grow thick with everything they were not saying. This was dangerous. This conversation had strayed far from the safe territory of investments and estate business into something much more treacherous. "Shall we review those documents?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maximilian seemed to shake himself, as though waking from a trance. "Yes, of course, if you are finished with your breakfast, we can adjourn to my study." Elizabeth followed him through the familiar corridors of Ashworth Manor, acutely aware of his presence beside her. He walked with the unconscious grace of a man completely comfortable in his own body, and she found herself noticing small details she had tried not to notice the night before. The way his coat stretched across his broad shoulders, the lean strength evident in his movements, the faint scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that made her want to move closer. This was madness. She needed to control herself, to remember who they were and what stood between them. The study was exactly as she remembered it, a masculine sanctuary of leather and wood, floor-to-ceiling bookcases lining 3 walls, a massive desk positioned to catch the morning light. Maximilian gestured to one of the chairs positioned before the desk, but Elizabeth found herself drawn instead to the window, to the view of the gardens she had loved so well. "I used to watch you from here," Maximilian said suddenly, and Elizabeth turned to find him standing very still, his hands clasped behind his back. "When you walked in the gardens, I would tell myself I was merely ensuring you were safe, but that was a lie. I watched because I could not help myself." Elizabeth's heart began to pound. "Your Grace." "Maximilian," he said quietly, "when we are alone, please. We have known each other too long for such formality." "Maximilian," she repeated, and the name felt both forbidden and right on her tongue. "Why are you telling me this?" He moved closer, and she saw that the careful control he wore like armor was cracking, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. "Because I am tired of lies, tired of pretending. You asked last night if I had been well, and I gave you the answer propriety demanded. But the truth is that I have not been well since the day I watched you marry my brother." Elizabeth could not breathe, could not move, could only stand frozen as he continued, the words pouring from him as though a dam had burst. "I have spent 12 years loving you in silence," Maximilian said, his voice rough with emotion. 12 years of watching you belong to someone else, of playing the role of brother when I wanted to be so much more, and I told myself it was enough, that simply being near you was sufficient. But it was never enough, Elizabeth. It will never be enough." "Stop," she whispered, though she was not certain whether she meant the word or whether it was simply the only sound she could form. "I should not have spoken," he said, turning away from her abruptly. "Forgive me. This is unforgivable. You came here seeking help with business matters, and I have—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was utterly unlike his usual composed self. "I will arrange for my solicitor to review your documents. You need not remain at Ashworth Manor. I will send you whatever recommendations—" "I love you," Elizabeth said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread and spread. Maximilian froze, his back still to her, and she saw his shoulders tense, Elizabeth, I love you, she repeated, stronger now. I have loved you since that first night at the Pemberton ball. Before I even knew Dominique existed, before I understood what love truly was, I loved you. He turned slowly, and she saw that his face had gone pale. You married my brother. Yes, she said, and tears began to slip down her cheeks, though she did not bother to wipe them away. I married Dominique because I was 18 and foolish, and I convinced myself that what I felt for you was impossible, because he was kind and charming and offered me everything a young girl thinks she wants. Because you were a duke and I was nobody, and I thought, her voice broke, I thought you could never want someone like me. Could never want... Maximilian crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, grasping her shoulders with barely restrained intensity. Elizabeth, you were everything. You are everything. There has not been a day, not an hour, when I have not wanted you. They stood so close now that Elizabeth could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes, could feel the heat of his body, could count his heartbeats in the pulse that hammered in his throat. This is impossible, she whispered. I know. You were his brother. I was his wife. We cannot... I know, he said again, but his hands had moved from her shoulders to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. We cannot. We should not. And yet here we are. What are we going to do? For answer, Maximilian bent his head and captured her lips with his own. The kiss was nothing like what Elizabeth had imagined during all those long, lonely nights in Cornwall. It was not gentle or tentative or careful. It was desperate and claiming and utterly consuming, as though 12 years of denied desire had condensed into this single moment. His mouth moved over hers with fierce possession, and she responded with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer still. They kissed as though they were drowning, and each was the other's only hope of salvation. Kissed until Elizabeth was dizzy with it, until the world had narrowed to the taste of him, the feel of his hands in her hair, the solid strength of his body against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maximilian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. We should not have done that, he said roughly. No, Elizabeth agreed, but she did not let go of his coat. We should not. If anyone knew, I know. He opened his eyes, and the anguish she saw there made her heart clench. Elizabeth, I cannot offer you marriage. You must understand that. You are my brother's widow. The scandal would be... I know, she interrupted. I understand. The church, society, everyone would condemn us. You would lose your standing, your reputation, everything you have built. I care nothing for any of that, he said fiercely, but I will not make you the subject of gossip and scorn. I will not watch society tear you apart. Elizabeth stepped back, needing distance to think clearly, though her body protested the loss of his warmth. She moved to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Then what can we have? She asked quietly. What is possible for us? The silence stretched so long that she thought he might not answer. Then she heard him move behind her, felt his presence at her back, though he did not touch her. I do not know, he admitted, but I cannot pretend any more, Elizabeth. I cannot stand before you and act as though you are merely my brother's widow, someone for whom I feel only familial concern. Not now. Not after this. She turned to face him, and in his eyes she saw the same longing that consumed her, the same desperate hope warring with impossible circumstance. What would you have me do? She asked. Return to Cornwall? Pretend this conversation never happened? I would have you stay, he said, and the raw honesty in his voice made her tremble. Stay here at Ashworth Manor. Not in the dower house, not in exile, but here. With me. As what? Your sister-in-law, your ward? As the woman I love, he said simply. Let society think what it will. We need not explain ourselves to anyone. You would risk your reputation. My reputation be damned, he said with sudden vehemence. I have spent my entire adult life doing what was proper, what was expected, what was right. I gave up the woman I loved for duty's sake. I have been the perfect duke, the perfect brother, the perfect peer, and I am tired, Elizabeth. So profoundly tired of being perfect. She stared at him, seeing him truly perhaps for the first time. Not the Duke of Ravenscroft, not the marble paragon society believed him to be, but simply Maximilian, a man who had sacrificed his own happiness for so long that he had almost forgotten it was possible to want more. "If I stay," she said carefully, "if we do this, whatever this is, we must be discreet. I will not have your name dragged through the mud because of me." "Elizabeth, I mean it, Maximilian. I know what I am risking. I am a widow. Society will think the worst of me regardless. But you are a duke. You have responsibilities, obligations. We must be careful." He studied her for a long moment, and she saw the battle raging behind his eyes. Desire warring with duty, love fighting against a lifetime of careful control. "I can give you time," he said finally. "We need not decide everything today. Stay for a fortnight at least." "Let us see." He broke off, seeming to struggle for words. "Let us see what might be possible." It was not a declaration of forever. It was not a promise of marriage or even of a future together. But it was something, and Elizabeth found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to do so. "A fortnight," she agreed. Maximilian exhaled, and some of the tension drained from his frame. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not running, for staying, for giving us this chance, however small." She moved closer to him, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. He closed his eyes at the contact, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm, and Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling. "I should have fought for you 12 years ago," she said softly. "I should have been braver." "You were 18, he replied, opening his eyes. "And I was a coward. If I had had any courage at all, I would have told you how I felt before Dominique had a chance to sweep you away. And would I have believed you? Would I have had the strength to choose you over someone who offered me security without risk? I suppose we will never know." "No," she agreed. "But we are not those people anymore. We are not the Duke and the debutante. We are simply two people who have loved each other across time and circumstance and loss. Two people who have already waited 12 years, Maximilian said, and there was something hungry in his voice that made heat pool in her belly. "I do not wish to waste what time we might have." He pulled her close again, and this time when he kissed her, there was a tenderness mixed with the passion, a sense of wonder that this was finally happening, that they were finally allowing themselves this happiness. When they broke apart, Elizabeth rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of how much I feel, of what we are risking, of what will happen when this fortnight ends." His arms tightened around her. "Then let us not think of endings, not today. Today let us simply be." It was, she thought, the most un-Duke-like thing she had ever heard him say, and she loved him all the more for it. They stood together in the morning light streaming through the window, holding each other as though they could stop time through will alone. And for that moment at least, the world and its demands seemed very far away. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Elizabeth. On the surface, life at Ashworth Manor continued exactly as it had before. She and Maximilian maintained perfect propriety in the presence of the servants, dined formally each evening, conducted themselves with all the decorum their positions required. But in the stolen moments when they were alone, everything changed. They walked together in the gardens in the early mornings, before the household stirred, talking with the ease that had always characterized their conversations, but now without the careful distance that had once kept them separated. They spent afternoons in the library, ostensibly reading, but more often simply existing in each other's company, learning the small intimacies of shared silence. And sometimes, when they were certain they would not be disturbed, they allowed themselves the forbidden pleasure of touch. A kiss in the shadowed alcove of the music room, her hand in his as they stood watching the sunset from the terrace, his arms around her waist as they swayed to music only they could hear. It was both more and less than Elizabeth had dreamed of. More because every moment with Maximilian was suffused with a joy she had never known, a sense of rightness that made her wonder how she had survived the years without him. Less because the shadow of impossibility hung over everything, the knowledge that this interlude could not last, that reality would eventually intrude upon their carefully constructed sanctuary. On the 5th day of her visit, Elizabeth woke to find rain drumming against the windows. the kind of steady downpour that promised to last all day. She dressed and descended to the breakfast room to find Maximilian already there, looking out at the grey morning with an expression of such melancholy that it made her heart ache. "You are thinking too much," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. He glanced at her, and she saw the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. "I am always thinking too much. It is my particular curse." "Then allow me to distract you." She took his hand, twining her fingers with his. "What shall we do with this rainy day?" "I have estate business that requires attention." "Maximilian," he sighed, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "You are bad for my productivity, Lady Elizabeth." "Good," she said firmly. "You work too hard. When was the last time you took a day simply for yourself?" "I cannot recall." "Then today shall be that day. I demand it." "You demand it?" His eyebrows rose in aristocratic amusement. "And since when does a duke take orders from the woman who loves him?" she finished. "Since he realized that love is more important than duty." The amusement faded from his face, replaced by something fierce and tender. "You are dangerous," he said softly. "You make me want things I cannot have." "Then let us pretend just for today that you can have them, that we are simply Maximilian and Elizabeth, with no titles or obligations or impossible circumstances, just two people on a rainy day." She saw him waver, saw the eternal battle between duty and desire play out across his features. Then, deliberately, he set down the papers he had been holding and took both her hands in his. "Very well," he said. "What does one do on a rainy day when one is simply Maximilian and Elizabeth?" Elizabeth felt triumph surge through her, followed immediately by nervousness. She had not actually planned beyond securing his agreement. What did they do now? "We could play chess," she suggested tentatively. "I always win at chess." "Then I shall simply have to improve my game, unless you're afraid of competition." He laughed, actually laughed, a sound of such pure delight that it made her want to weep. How long had it been since she had heard him laugh without restraint? "I am many things, Elizabeth, but afraid of you at chess is not one of them." "Very well, let us play." They settled in the library, the chessboard between them, and Elizabeth discovered that Maximilian had not been exaggerating about his skill. He defeated her soundly in the first game and the second, and was well on his way to winning the third when she finally threw up her hands in surrender. "This is not fair," she complained. "You have had years more practice than I." "You are improving," he said, studying the board. "Your defense has grown considerably stronger since the first game." "My defense is the only thing keeping me from complete humiliation." "Chess is not unlike life," Maximilian mused, leaning back in his chair. "The key is learning which pieces to sacrifice and which to protect at all costs." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "And which am I? A piece to be sacrificed or protected?" The levity drained from his expression. "You are the queen," he said quietly, "the most powerful piece on the board, the one around which every strategy revolves, the one I would sacrifice everything else to keep safe." "Even yourself?" "Especially myself." She rose and moved around the table to stand before him. Maximilian looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he could not say aloud. The love, the longing, the quiet desperation of a man who had found what he wanted most in the world and knew he might have to give it up. "I do not want you to sacrifice yourself," Elizabeth said, cupping his face in her hands. "I want us to find a way to both be safe, to both be happy." "That may not be possible." "Then we shall make it possible." She bent and kissed him softly. "We are not chess pieces, Maximilian. We are people with will and choice and the ability to shape our own destiny." He pulled her down onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she went willingly, settling against him with a sigh of contentment. They sat like that for a long while, listening to the rain, wrapped in each other and the quiet peace of the moment. "Tell me about Cornwall," Maximilian said eventually. "What was your life like there?" Elizabeth considered how to answer. "Lonely," she said finally. "I told myself I was mourning, that I needed solitude to grieve properly, but the truth is I was hiding, from society, from memory, from you." From me? Every letter you sent was torture, she admitted. Your handwriting, your words, always so proper, so distant. I would read them and imagine what you might say if you allowed yourself to be honest. And then I would hate myself for thinking of you at all when I should have been thinking of Dominique. Maximilian's arms tightened around her. I wrote 100 different versions of every letter, poured out my heart, and then burned the pages because I had no right to burden you with feelings you could not reciprocate. Except I did reciprocate them. We were both suffering in silence, both convinced we were alone in our feelings. What a waste, he said bitterly, all those years. Not wasted, Elizabeth corrected gently. We needed them. We needed time to grieve, to grow, to become the people we are now. If we had come together too soon, the guilt would have destroyed us. And you feel no guilt now. She was quiet for a moment, examining her conscience with ruthless honesty. I feel guilt about many things, she said slowly. About not loving Dominique the way he deserved. About being glad sometimes that I am free to feel what I feel for you without betrayal. But guilt about loving you? No. I think perhaps I have always loved you from that very first moment, and I cannot feel guilty about something that feels as fundamental as breathing. You are much braver than I, Maximilian said. No, I have simply learned that life is too short to spend it denying what makes us happy. Dominique taught me that in the end. How so? Elizabeth shifted to look at him directly. He knew, she said quietly. Before he died, I think he knew that my heart belonged to you. Maximilian went very still. He never said anything to me. No, he would not have. But there were moments in those last months when he would look at me with such sadness. And once, when he had perhaps drunk too much wine, he said something strange. What did he say? He said, "Promise me that when I am gone, you will not spend your life alone. Promise me you will find someone who loves you as you deserve to be loved." And when I asked what he meant, he just smiled and said, "You know who I mean." Maximilian closed his eyes, and Elizabeth saw a muscle jump in his jaw. I should have been more careful. If he suspected, it was not your fault, Elizabeth said firmly. You were always perfectly proper. If Dominique sensed anything, it was because he knew us both well enough to see what we were trying so hard to hide. And that is supposed to make me feel better? No, it is supposed to make you understand that he would not have wanted us to suffer forever, out of some misguided sense of loyalty to his memory. Dominique loved life, loved joy. He would hate knowing that his death has kept two people who love each other apart. Maximilian opened his eyes and looked at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. You truly believe that? I do. He pulled her close and kissed her, and this time there was a quality of surrender in it, as though he had finally stopped fighting against what they both wanted. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. What are we going to do? He asked, echoing her question from days before. I do not know, she admitted, but I know I do not want to leave at the end of this fortnight. Then do not leave. It is not that simple. Why not? He drew back to look at her. You said yourself that your father's house is small, his circumstances modest. You need not return there. Stay here. Ashworth Manor is as much your home as anywhere. Maximilian, people will talk. Let them talk. You say that now, but when the gossip starts, when society begins to speculate about the nature of our relationship, then they will be correct in their speculation, he said bluntly. Elizabeth, I am not suggesting we parade our feelings before the ton. I am not fool enough to think we can marry, much as I wish it were otherwise. But surely we can find some middle ground between the impossible and the nothing we have had for 12 years. She wanted to agree, wanted it so desperately that it frightened her. But she had to be practical, had to consider all the implications. What exactly are you proposing? She asked carefully. Stay at Ashworth Manor as my permanent guest. To the world you are my brother's widow, a woman of respectable but modest means whom I am assisting out of family obligation. No one need know anything beyond that. And in private? In private, you are mine, he said with quiet possession, as I am yours. We make no promises we cannot keep, acknowledge no future we cannot have, but for whatever time we are given, We are together. It was not a declaration of forever. It offered no security, no guarantee. They would be living a lie, always careful, always hidden, but it was more than they had, and less than they deserved, and Elizabeth found that her heart was saying yes, even as her mind catalogued all the reasons she should refuse. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need." But even as he said it, they both knew that time was not unlimited, that each day brought them closer to the moment when she would have to decide, return to Cornwall and the safety of solitude, or stay at Ashworth Manor and risk everything for a chance at happiness. The rain continued to fall, and they sat together in the library, wrapped in each other's arms, as though they could hold back the future through will alone. That evening, dinner was a strained affair. The easy companionship of the morning had given way to tension as the weight of decision pressed upon them both. Elizabeth picked at her food, her appetite gone, while Maximilian drank more wine than was his custom, his usual control fraying at the edges. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Elizabeth set down her fork. "I have been thinking about what you said," she began. Maximilian looked up, and she saw hope and fear war in his expression. And I think—" She broke off, struggling to find the right words. "I think we need to be honest about what we are asking of each other. You speak of my staying here as though it were simple, but there is nothing simple about what you are proposing. I know that. Do you?" She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You are asking me to live in your home, under your protection, with all the implications that carries, to be dependent upon your goodwill, your discretion. If you should tire of me, if you should meet someone you could actually marry—" "That will not happen," he said fiercely. "You cannot know that. You are 37, Maximilian, in the prime of your life. You should marry, should have an heir. The duchy requires it." "The duchy has required many things of me," he said, his voice hard. "I have given it my entire life. Surely I am entitled to one thing that is mine alone. But I would not be yours alone. I would be your dirty secret, the woman you cannot acknowledge. How long before you came to resent me for it?" He rose from his chair and came around the table to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his. "Elizabeth, look at me." She did, and saw in his eyes a certainty that took her breath away. "I have loved you for 12 years, he said. 12 years of watching you belong to someone else, of playing a role I hated, of pretending I felt something other than what consumed me every waking moment. Do you truly believe that I would offer you this? Would ask you to stay? If I had any doubt about what I want? People change, I will not change. Not about this, not about you." He raised her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with infinite tenderness. "If I could marry you, I would do so tomorrow. If I could give you my name, my title, everything I possess, I would lay it all at your feet without hesitation. But since I cannot, I am asking you to accept what I can offer. My home, my protection, my devotion. For as long as you will have me." Tears spilled down Elizabeth's cheeks. "And what do I offer you in return? What do I bring to this arrangement beyond scandal and complication?" "You bring yourself," he said simply. "That is all I have ever wanted, all I will ever need." She looked at him kneeling before her, this proud man who commanded the respect of Parliament and the admiration of society, and saw only Maximilian, the man who had loved her in silence for 12 years, who had put her happiness before his own, again and again, who was now offering her everything he had to give, even knowing it could never be enough. And she made her decision. "I will stay," she whispered. For a moment, Maximilian did not move, as though he had not quite heard her correctly. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so intense it transformed his entire countenance. "You will stay," he repeated, as though testing the words. "I will stay," she confirmed, and found herself smiling through her tears. "I will be your impossible love, your secret happiness. And if society condemns us, if people whisper and speculate, we shall weather it together." He surged to his feet, pulling her up with him, and kissed her with a fierce possession that left no room for doubt about what this meant to him. Elizabeth returned the kiss with equal fervor, pouring into it all the love and longing she had kept locked away for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maximilian rested his forehead against hers. "I do not deserve you," he said roughly. "Then perhaps we are even," Elizabeth replied, "for I certainly do not deserve your devotion. We shall have to disagree on that point." She laughed, and the sound was bright with possibility, with hope, with the future they were choosing to build together, despite all the reasons they should not. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Maximilian said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "We determine how to make this work. You will need your own rooms, of course. The Rose Suite is yours for as long as you wish it. We must be discreet, especially with the servants. The household will gossip regardless, but we need not provide them with proof of anything improper." "I understand. There will be times when I must entertain, when society demands my presence. You need not attend those functions if you do not wish to." "And if I do wish to?" He smiled. "Then you will attend as a valued member of my household, my brother's widow. Nothing more, nothing less." It was not an ideal solution. There would be challenges, complications, moments when the restrictions chafed, but standing there in his arms, looking into eyes that held 12 years of love, Elizabeth found she did not care about ideal. She cared only about this, about him, about them, about the chance they were finally allowing themselves. "When shall I send for the rest of my things?" she asked practically. "Tomorrow, today, whenever you wish." He grinned, and it made him look younger, happier than she had ever seen him. "I confess I am impatient to have the matter settled. Afraid I will change my mind. Terrified," he admitted. "I feel as though I am in a dream from which I might wake at any moment." Elizabeth reached up and touched his face, letting him feel the reality of her presence. "This is no dream," she said softly. "This is our life, strange and impossible, and utterly real." "Our life," he repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." They stood together in the dining room, holding each other as the candles burned low and the household settled into sleep around them. For the first time in 12 years, Elizabeth felt truly at peace. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges and risks, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, they established a rhythm that was both familiar and entirely new. To the household and the few visitors who called at Ashworth Manor, Elizabeth was simply the Duke's sister-in-law, a widow of modest means, who had taken up permanent residence in the Rose Suite. The servants gossiped, of course. Servants always did, but they had no proof of anything improper, and Maximilian was such a formidable presence that no one dared question his arrangements aloud. In private, however, the house became a sanctuary for their love. They stole moments throughout the day, meetings in the library that were ostensibly about books, but became opportunities for stolen kisses, walks in the garden where they could talk freely without fear of being overheard, evenings in his study after the servants had retired, where they could simply exist together without pretense. Elizabeth discovered things about Maximilian that 12 years of acquaintance had never revealed. She learned that he was ticklish along his ribs, that he had a surprisingly terrible singing voice, that he preferred his eggs soft-boiled and became grumpy if he did not have his morning coffee. She learned the feel of his laughter rumbling through his chest when she lay against him, the way his hands trembled slightly when he touched her face, the particular way his eyes darkened when he looked at her with desire. And Maximilian, in turn, learned her, learned that she had nightmares sometimes, and woke disoriented, needing reassurance, learned that she liked to read poetry aloud when she thought no one was listening, learned that she had a sharp wit that she often hid behind proper manners, and a stubbornness that matched his own when she believed herself in the right. They were, Elizabeth thought, learning to be together, not as Duke and sister-in-law, not as the people society expected them to be, but as simply Maximilian and Elizabeth, two souls who had found each other across time and circumstance and refused to let go. But there were difficulties too. Moments when the restrictions of their situation chafed, when Elizabeth felt the weight of being a secret pressing upon her. Times when Maximilian's duties as Duke required him to attend functions where she could not follow, and she spent evenings alone in the Rose Suite, trying not to think about the eligible young ladies being paraded before him. And there were the memories. Always there were memories. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after her arrival, Elizabeth found herself in the East Wing, standing before the door to the rooms she had shared with Dominique. She had not entered them since her return, had avoided this corridor entirely, but today something drew her here, a need to confront the past, perhaps, or simply to make peace with it. She turned the handle and entered. The rooms were exactly as she had left them. The furniture stood in its familiar arrangement, dust covers protecting the upholstery. The curtains were drawn, casting everything in a dim half-light that made it feel suspended in time. Elizabeth moved through the space slowly, touching things as she went. The desk where Dominique had sat to write his letters, the chair where he liked to read, the window that overlooked the lake. She felt tears prick her eyes, but they were gentle tears, sad but no longer agonizing. "I am sorry," she whispered to the silence. "I am sorry I could not love you the way you deserved. Sorry that my heart was always divided. But I did love you, Dominique. In my way, I did." He knew that. Elizabeth spun around to find Maximilian standing in the doorway, his expression gentle. "I did not hear you come in," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I saw you enter the East Wing. I wanted to make sure you were all right." He stepped into the room, looking around with his own sadness. "I have not been in here since the day we packed away his things. Why have you kept it like this? Why not put someone else in these rooms?" "I suppose I thought you might want them preserved," he admitted. "Some memorial to what was." Elizabeth looked at him, this man who had thought of everything, who had protected even the memory of his brother's marriage, despite his own feelings. "I think it is time to let go," she said softly. "Not of his memory. I will always carry that with me. But of this shrine to the past. These rooms should be used, lived in. Keeping them like this helps no one." Maximilian crossed to her, taking her hands. "Are you certain?" "I am," Elizabeth confirmed. "Dominique would not have wanted us frozen in grief. He lived for joy, for movement forward. Let us honor him by doing the same." Maximilian nodded slowly, then pulled her into his arms. They stood together in the fading light of Dominique's rooms, mourning what had been lost and accepting what they had found. "I will have the staff prepare these rooms for guests," Maximilian said eventually. "And perhaps we might establish a scholarship in his name for young men wishing to study at university. He would have liked that." "He would have loved it," Elizabeth agreed. They left the East Wing together, closing the door on the past, and Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, not the forgetting of what had been, but the acceptance of what was. She had loved Dominique as well as she was able. She had mourned him properly, and now she was choosing to live again, to embrace the happiness that had found her in the most unexpected of places. Summer arrived in full glory, transforming Ashworth Manor into something out of a fairy tale. The gardens bloomed with extravagant color, the days stretched long and golden, and the house itself seemed to relax into the warmth, as though it too had been waiting for this season of happiness. Elizabeth had been in residence for 3 months, and the household had settled into their new normal. The servants no longer whispered quite so much, or if they did, they kept their speculation to themselves. Lady Elizabeth was a fixture now, someone who belonged, and if the Duke seemed happier than he had been in years, well, that was surely a good thing. For Maximilian, these months had been a revelation. He had spent so long believing that happiness was something other people experienced, something forever beyond his reach, that he hardly knew what to do with it now that it had arrived. He found himself smiling at odd moments, humming while he worked, feeling a lightness in his chest that he had not experienced since before his father died, and the weight of the duchy settled onto his shoulders. Elizabeth was everywhere in his life now. Her presence had transformed Ashworth Manor from a house into a home. She had redecorated the drawing room with bright fabrics and fresh flowers, had reorganized his library according to some system that made sense only to her but worked brilliantly, had somehow convinced his cook to try new recipes that resulted in dinners that were actual delights rather than mere sustenance. But more than the physical changes, she had changed him, had taught him that it was acceptable to take an afternoon for pleasure rather than work, that laughter was not a sign of weakness, that love could be sustaining rather than painful. They had been careful, discreet, exactly as they had promised each other. But there were moments when Maximilian wanted nothing more than to announce to all of England that Elizabeth was his, propriety be damned. Moments when he resented the necessity of keeping their love hidden, of pretending she was merely his brother's widow rather than the woman who owned his heart entirely. One such moment came on a particularly glorious July afternoon when they were entertaining visitors, Lord and Lady Pembroke, old family friends who had called to pay their respects. Elizabeth had joined them for tea in the drawing-room, playing the role of gracious hostess with perfect aplomb, and Maximilian had been forced to watch as Lord Pembroke, a widower himself, paid her marked attention. "Lady Elizabeth, you must visit our estate in Kent," Lord Pembroke was saying, his admiration barely disguised. "My gardens are said to rival even those of Ashworth Manor, and I would be honoured to show them to you." "You are too kind, my lord," Elizabeth replied with polite distance. But Maximilian saw the way Pembroke looked at her and felt something primitive and possessive surge through him. "Not at all. A beautiful woman deserves beautiful surroundings, and may I say mourning becomes you. You are even lovelier than I remembered." Maximilian's hand tightened on his teacup with enough force that he was surprised it did not shatter. Lady Pembroke, bless her, seemed to sense the tension and quickly changed the subject. "Your Grace, I understand you are establishing a scholarship in Lord Dominique's name. What a wonderful tribute to your brother." Maximilian forced himself to respond civilly, to engage in the mundane conversation of social calls, but his attention remained fixed on Elizabeth and Pembroke. The man had moved closer to her on the settee, was speaking in tones meant for her ears alone, and Elizabeth, damn her, was smiling at something he said. When the Pembrokes finally took their leave, Maximilian saw them to the door with all the courtesy his position demanded, then returned to the drawing-room to find Elizabeth standing by the window, her shoulders tight with tension. "Well," she said without turning around. "That was interesting." "Pembroke was flirting with you," Maximilian said flatly. "Yes, I noticed. And you seemed to enjoy it." Now she did turn, and he saw fire in her eyes. "I was being polite as the situation demanded." "What would you have had me do? Announce to Lord Pembroke that I could not accept his invitation because I am actually involved in a secret liaison with my brother-in-law?" The words hit like a slap, and Maximilian felt his own temper rise to match hers. "Of course not. But you need not have been quite so encouraging." "Encouraging?" I smiled at a pleasant man who was attempting to be kind. "That is called courtesy, Your Grace." "Do not call me that. Not in private." "Why not? It is what you are, after all, the Duke of Ravenscroft, far too important to actually claim the woman he supposedly loves." Maximilian crossed the room in 3 strides, grasping her shoulders. "Is that what you think? That I am ashamed of you? I think that you want me safely hidden where no one can question your precious reputation," Elizabeth shot back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think that while I have given up everything, my home, my independence, any chance of a normal future, you have given up nothing. Given up nothing." The words came out in a roar that would have made his servants scatter had any been nearby. "Elizabeth, I have given up everything that matters. Marriage, an heir, the respect of my peers if this ever becomes known. I have risked scandal and social ruin to keep you with me. Yes, to keep me hidden, to keep me secret. Do you know what it is like to watch women parade before you at every social function, knowing that any one of them would be a more suitable match than I? To know that I have no claim on you whatsoever, that if you decided tomorrow that you were done with me, I would have no choice but to leave?" The anguish in her voice stopped his anger cold. He released her shoulders, stepping back as understanding dawned. "You think I would discard you," he said slowly. "You think this is some temporary arrangement until I find a proper wife." "What else am I to think?" she asked, and now the tears did fall. "You have made me no promises, Maximilian. You have offered me no future. I am living in your home on your sufferance, and that could end at any moment." "It will not end. I have told you. You have told me you love me. But love and commitment are not the same thing, and I am beginning to realize that perhaps I have made a terrible mistake." The words struck him like a physical blow. "You wish to leave?" "I do not know what I wish anymore," she said wearily. "I only know that watching Lord Pembroke flirt with me and being unable to tell him that my heart belongs to someone else was more painful than I anticipated. and I find myself wondering how long I can continue like this before it destroys me." Maximilian felt panic rise in his chest, cold and paralyzing. The thought of Elizabeth leaving, of losing her again after finally having her, was unbearable. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and was ashamed to hear his voice shake. "Tell me what you need, and I will provide it." She looked at him with such sadness that it made his heart ache. "I need to know that I matter more than your reputation, more than society's opinion, more than the expectations that have governed your entire life. You do matter more. You matter more than anything." "Then prove it." They stared at each other across the drawing room, the ultimatum hanging between them like a sword. Maximilian's mind raced, searching for some solution, some way to give Elizabeth what she needed without destroying everything they had built. But before he could speak, she turned away. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I should not have said that. You have been more than generous, and I have no right to ask for more." "Elizabeth, I need to be alone," she interrupted. "Please." She left the drawing room before he could stop her, and Maximilian stood frozen, listening to her footsteps fade down the corridor. Then he collapsed into the nearest chair, his head in his hands, and faced a truth he had been avoiding for months. This arrangement, the careful discretion, the hidden love, was not sustainable. Something had to change, or he would lose her. And losing Elizabeth was simply not an option. Elizabeth did not appear for dinner that evening, sending word that she had a headache and would take a tray in her room. Maximilian ate alone in the dining room, the food turning to ash in his mouth, and tried to determine what he should do. The conventional path was clear: apologize, promise to be more demonstrative in private, while maintaining their careful discretion in public, hope that time would ease her doubts. It was the safe option, the sensible one. But Maximilian was tired of safe and sensible, tired of doing what was expected rather than what he wanted. And what he wanted, what he needed with a desperation that bordered on violence, was to make Elizabeth his in every way that mattered. The problem was how to accomplish that without destroying them both in the process. He was still pondering this question when Henderson appeared in the doorway, looking unusually hesitant. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but there is a gentleman here to see you. He arrived without notice and insists the matter is urgent." Maximilian frowned. "At this hour? Who is it?" "The Viscount Ashford, Your Grace." Maximilian went very still. Viscount Ashford was his cousin, his late father's nephew, and technically the heir to the duchy if Maximilian died without issue. They had never been close. Ashford was a dissolute fool who spent more time in gaming hells than managing his own modest estates. The man had no reason to call at Ashworth Manor, especially unannounced. "Show him to my study," Maximilian said, rising. "And Henderson, do not mention Lady Elizabeth's presence to the Viscount." "Of course, Your Grace." Maximilian made his way to the study, his mind already working through possibilities. Ashford's arrival could not be coincidence, not after all these years of minimal contact. The man wanted something, and Maximilian suspected he would not like what it was. He was correct. Viscount Ashford was sprawled in one of the study's leather chairs when Maximilian entered, looking entirely too comfortable. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, with the dark Ashworth colouring and a charm that concealed a calculating nature. "Cousin," Ashford said, rising with exaggerated courtesy. "How good of you to receive me at such an hour." "What do you want, Ashford?" Maximilian asked bluntly, not bothering with pleasantries. "Direct as always. Very well. I shall be equally direct." Ashford's smile took on a predatory edge. "I have heard the most interesting rumors about your household lately." Maximilian's expression did not change, though he felt ice form in his veins. "I am not interested in gossip." "Oh, but this is such fascinating gossip. They say you have taken in your late brother's widow, that she lives here in your home under your protection, and that the two of you are, how shall I put this delicately, remarkably devoted to one another." "Lady Elizabeth is family. I am fulfilling my obligation to my brother's memory by ensuring she is cared for." Of course," Ashford said with a knowing smile. "Purely familial devotion. I am certain the Archbishop would see it exactly that way should someone bring the matter to his attention." There it was, the threat barely veiled. "What do you want?" Maximilian repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "I find myself in a bit of financial difficulty," Ashford admitted, dropping all pretense. "Gaming debts, you understand, significant ones, and I thought to myself, surely my dear cousin, who has always been so concerned with propriety and reputation, would be willing to assist me in my time of need, particularly if it meant avoiding an unfortunate scandal. You are attempting to blackmail me. Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. You pay my debts, I remain remarkably disinterested in your domestic arrangements. Everyone wins." Maximilian moved to stand behind his desk, needing the barrier between them to keep from doing something he would regret. "And if I refuse? Then I am afraid I would have no choice but to make my concerns known to certain members of the clergy and society. The Duke of Ravenscroft living in sin with his brother's widow, it would be the scandal of the decade. Your reputation would be destroyed. And Lady Elizabeth, well, she would be utterly ruined. No respectable household would receive her. She would become a pariah." Every word was true, and they both knew it. If Ashford made good on his threat, Elizabeth would be destroyed. Maximilian could weather scandal himself. He had power and position enough to rebuild eventually. But Elizabeth had neither, and society was merciless toward women who transgressed. "How much?" Maximilian asked flatly. Ashford named a sum that was extortionate, but not impossible. Maximilian could pay it, though it would require liquidating some investments. "Very well," he said, his voice empty of emotion. "I will have my solicitor draw up the necessary documents." "Excellent. I knew you would be reasonable, cousin. And of course, this ensures my complete discretion going forward. I am nothing if not a man of honor." The irony of that statement was so profound that Maximilian almost laughed. Almost. "Get out of my house," he said instead. Ashford rose, all false bonhomie. "I shall await word from your solicitor." "Thank you for your generosity, Your Grace. Family should always help family, after all." He left, and Maximilian stood alone in his study, fury and frustration warring within him. He had been a fool to think they could maintain this arrangement without consequences, had been naive to believe that their careful discretion would be sufficient protection. And now they had a choice: continue as they were, always vulnerable to exposure and blackmail, or make a change so dramatic that it eliminated all possibility of scandal because there would be nothing left to hide. The answer came to him with sudden clarity, so obvious he wondered why he had not seen it before. He had been asking the wrong question. The question was not how to keep Elizabeth hidden, but how to claim her so publicly, so completely, that no one would dare question his right to do so. And there was only one way to accomplish that. Elizabeth was sitting by the window in the Rose Suite, staring out at the moonlit gardens when she heard the knock on her door. She had been crying, something she despised, but seemed unable to prevent lately, and she quickly dabbed at her eyes before calling out permission to enter. She expected Agnes, perhaps bringing a fresh pot of tea. She did not expect Maximilian to stride into her room with an expression of such fierce determination that it made her breath catch. "Maximilian, you should not be here," she said, rising quickly. "If anyone sees—" "I do not care who sees," he said, and there was something in his voice that was different, dangerous. "Let them see. Let them all see." "What are you talking about?" He crossed to her in 3 long strides, taking her hands in his with barely restrained intensity. "Marry me." Elizabeth stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, and now she saw that his eyes were blazing with an emotion she could not name, triumph mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Marry me, Elizabeth. Be my wife in truth, not just in my heart." "Maximilian, we cannot. You know we cannot. I was Dominique's wife. The church forbids a man from marrying his brother's widow, yes, in England, but not everywhere. There are places, Scotland, certain European countries, where such marriages are permitted. We could go to Scotland, marry there, and return as husband and wife." Elizabeth felt dizzy, the world tilting beneath her. "The scandal would be enormous." "Let it be enormous. Let society rage and gossip and condemn. I do not care any more, Elizabeth. I am tired of caring what anyone thinks beyond you and me. What changed? This afternoon you were arguing that we needed to be discreet. This afternoon I was a fool, he interrupted. And this evening, my cousin Ashford paid me a visit with the express purpose of blackmailing me over our relationship. Elizabeth gasped. What? He knows, or suspects, which amounts to the same thing. He threatened to expose us unless I paid his considerable gaming debts, which I will do because I will not allow you to be hurt by this, but it made me realize something. What? That we are always going to be vulnerable like this, always living in fear of exposure, of scandal, of someone using our love as a weapon against us, unless we remove the weapon entirely by making our relationship legitimate. But the scandal will be terrible, he acknowledged. For approximately 6 months, we will be the most talked about couple in England. Society will be scandalized. The Archbishop will probably denounce us from the pulpit. We will be cut by half the ton. Your reputation will be destroyed. My reputation, he said with sudden vehemence, has been my prison for 30 years. I am tired of being the perfect duke, tired of sacrificing everything I want on the altar of propriety. I want you, Elizabeth. I want to wake up beside you every morning. I want to introduce you as my wife, not my brother's widow. I want children with you if we are blessed with them. I want a life, a real life, not this half-existence we have been maintaining. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears. You would risk everything for me? I would risk everything, he confirmed, because a life without you is not worth living, because you matter more to me than reputation or duty or the opinion of every peer in England, because I love you with everything I am, and I am done pretending otherwise. She looked at him, this man who had loved her in silence for 12 years, who had put her happiness before his own again and again, who was now offering to overturn his entire world for her sake, and felt her last defenses crumble. Yes, she whispered. Yes? He looked almost afraid to believe it. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will be your wife. Yes, to all of it, scandal and gossip and whatever comes. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with such fierce joy that it stole her breath. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing through their tears. We should leave immediately, Maximilian said, already planning. We can be in Scotland in 4 days if we travel hard. I will obtain a special license. Maximilian. He stopped, looking down at her. I love you, she said simply. I should have said it more. Should have said it every day since I arrived. But I was afraid, and I let fear make me small. I am done being small. I love you, and I am honored to be your wife. The honor is entirely mine, he said, and kissed her again. They spent the rest of the night making plans, giddy as children plotting an adventure. They would leave in 2 days, taking only what they needed, traveling as quickly as possible to Gretna Green, where marriages could be performed without banns or license. They would be married by a blacksmith over an anvil, utterly scandalous, completely irregular and perfectly legal. And then they would return to Ashworth Manor as husband and wife, and let society make of it what they would. Are you frightened? Elizabeth asked as dawn began to lighten the sky. Terrified, Maximilian admitted, but also happier than I have ever been. You make me brave, Elizabeth. You make me want to be more than I ever thought possible. Then we shall be brave together, she said, and sealed the promise with a kiss. 2 days later they departed Ashworth Manor before dawn, taking only a small travelling case and Maximilian's most trusted valet. They told no one where they were going or why, leaving instructions only that they were to be left undisturbed for a fortnight. The journey to Scotland was long and arduous, but Elizabeth had never been happier. They stopped at coaching inns along the way, and for the first time they shared a room without shame or secrecy. Maximilian would introduce her as his intended, and Elizabeth would feel a thrill every time, the reality of what they were doing slowly sinking in. They were really doing this, they were going to be married. On the 4th day, they crossed the border into Scotland, and Elizabeth felt something inside her shift, a sense of possibility opening up, of a future that had seemed impossible becoming real. They reached Gretna Green as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The famous blacksmith shop was exactly as Elizabeth had heard described, simple, unpretentious, utterly lacking in the grandeur one might expect for a ducal wedding. It was perfect. The blacksmith himself was a jovial man who had clearly performed this ceremony countless times. He showed no surprise at their rank or circumstances, merely asked if they were of age and willing, then proceeded with the brief but binding ceremony. "Do you, Maximilian James Ashworth, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Maximilian said, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. "And do you, Elizabeth Catherine Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Elizabeth replied, her voice strong and sure. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Maximilian did, thoroughly and completely, while the blacksmith and his wife applauded and Elizabeth laughed against his mouth. They were married. After 12 years of waiting, of loving in secret, of sacrificing and hiding and pretending, they were finally truly married. That night, in a small inn near the border, Maximilian made love to his wife for the first time. There was no shame in it now, no guilt or fear. There was only joy, fierce and complete and utterly transforming. "I love you," Elizabeth whispered against his skin. "I love you, I love you, I love you, and I love you," Maximilian replied, kissing her temple, her cheek, her lips. "My wife, my Elizabeth, mine." "Yours," she agreed, "for always." They stayed in Scotland for a week, glorying in their new status, reveling in the freedom of being together without concealment. But eventually reality called them back. They had to return to England, had to face whatever consequences awaited them. The journey back to Ashworth Manor was slower, more contemplative. They both knew that crossing back into England meant entering a storm. The ton would be scandalized. The church would condemn them. Friends might turn away, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. They arrived at Ashworth Manor on a bright morning in late August. The house looked exactly as they had left it, solid, enduring, home. But everything had changed, because they had changed. Henderson met them at the door, his face carefully neutral, though Elizabeth thought she saw approval in his eyes. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "Your Grace," he said, addressing them both, and Elizabeth felt a thrill at hearing herself called by her new title. "Thank you, Henderson," Maximilian said. "Please assemble the staff in the main hall. My wife and I have an announcement to make." Within minutes, the entire household had gathered. Footmen and maids, the cook and the gardeners, everyone who made Ashworth Manor function. They stood in careful rows, their expressions ranging from curious to knowing, and Elizabeth felt her heart pound. Maximilian took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze, then addressed the assembled staff. "I wish to inform you all that Lady Elizabeth and I were married in Scotland 1 week ago. She is now the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and I expect her to be treated with all the respect and deference that position commands." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, to Elizabeth's surprise, Henderson began to applaud. One by one, the rest of the staff joined in, and Elizabeth saw genuine happiness on many faces. Perhaps, she thought, they had not been as discreet as they had believed. Perhaps the household had known all along and had simply chosen to remain silent out of loyalty. "Thank you," Maximilian said, his voice rough with emotion. "That will be all." The staff dispersed and Maximilian turned to Elizabeth. "Well," he said, "that went better than expected." "Your staff loves you," Elizabeth replied, "and they want you to be happy." "Our staff," he corrected. "This is your home now, Elizabeth, truly and completely." She looked around the entrance hall, seeing it with new eyes, not as a place where she was merely tolerated, but as her home, her domain, the place where she would spend her life with the man she loved. "Our home," she repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." Over the following weeks, the scandal they had anticipated materialized with predictable fury. Letters arrived daily, some congratulatory, many condemning. Society columnists had a field day, speculating about the circumstances of their courtship, questioning the propriety of the marriage, debating whether the Duke had dishonored his brother's memory. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself sent a strongly worded missive expressing his disappointment in the Duke's choice and suggesting that perhaps a significant donation to the Church might help atone for the irregularity of the marriage. Maximilian responded to none of it. He went about his duties as Duke with his customary efficiency, made no apologies, and offered no explanations. To those who asked, he said simply that he had married a remarkable woman whom he loved deeply, and that was the end of the matter. Gradually, the furor began to die down. Other scandals captured society's attention. Those who truly cared about Maximilian came to accept his choice, if only because his happiness was so evident that it could not be denied. And those who refused to accept it, well, they simply stopped calling at Ashworth Manor, and neither Maximilian nor Elizabeth missed them. 6 months after their marriage, they attended their first major social event together as husband and wife, a ball hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire, one of the few grandes dames of society who had publicly expressed support for their union. Elizabeth wore a gown of deep sapphire that brought out the blue in her eyes, and Maximilian could not stop looking at her. She was breathtaking, and she was his wife, his duchess, his love. As they entered the ballroom, conversation dimmed. Heads turned. Elizabeth felt the weight of 100 judging eyes upon her, and for a moment her courage wavered. Then Maximilian's hand tightened on hers. "Do not let them make you small," he whispered. "You are the Duchess of Ravenscroft. You are my wife. You have nothing to apologize for." Elizabeth lifted her chin and smiled, and together they walked into the ballroom as though they owned it. Which, in a sense, they did, not because of his title or their wealth, but because they had earned their happiness through sacrifice and waiting and refusing to let the world dictate whom they could love. The Duchess of Devonshire greeted them warmly, making a point of praising Elizabeth's gown and discussing estate matters with Maximilian as though there had never been any scandal at all. Others followed her lead, and gradually the evening took on a festive air. At one point, Elizabeth found herself standing with a group of ladies who were discussing the latest fashions, and one, a young woman newly married herself, leaned close and whispered, "Your Grace, forgive my boldness, but I must tell you that you have given hope to many of us. To know that love can triumph even over the strictest propriety, it is wonderfully romantic." Elizabeth smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Perhaps they had done more than simply claim their own happiness. Perhaps in some small way, they had shown others that it was possible to choose love over convention, that the heart mattered more than society's rules. That night, as they prepared for bed in the ducal suite they now shared openly, Maximilian came up behind Elizabeth as she sat at her dressing table, placing his hands on her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "About how far we have come," she replied. "About how worth it all was. The waiting, the scandal, everything, because I have you." He bent to kiss the curve of her neck, and she shivered at the contact. "And I have you, my beautiful, brave Duchess." "Our story is not what I would have written," Elizabeth mused. "If someone had told me 12 years ago that I would marry one brother, lose him, and eventually marry the other, I would have thought it impossible, scandalous, wrong. And now? Now I think that perhaps love writes its own story, and ours, for all its complications and unconventional twists, is a love story nonetheless. Perhaps even more so because of everything we overcame to be together." Maximilian turned her chair so she faced him, then knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Elizabeth Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, I promise you that I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice, that we made the right choice." "You already have," she said, cupping his face. "Every day in 1,000 small ways, you show me that love is worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth everything." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and carried her to their bed. And as they came together in passion and love and perfect trust, Elizabeth thought that perhaps happy endings were not about perfection or ease. Perhaps they were about finding someone worth fighting for, and then refusing to let go no matter what the world threw at you. A year later, Elizabeth stood in the nursery of Ashworth Manor, holding her newborn daughter in her arms. The baby had Maximilian's dark hair and Elizabeth's blue eyes, and she was absolutely perfect. Maximilian entered quietly, his expression softening as he saw them. "How are my girls?" he asked, coming to wrap his arms around them both. "Perfect," Elizabeth replied, looking down at their daughter. She is absolutely perfect. Like her mother, Maximilian said, kissing Elizabeth's temple. We should decide on a name, Elizabeth said. I was thinking... She paused, suddenly uncertain. I was thinking perhaps Dominique, for a middle name. Maximilian was quiet for a moment, and Elizabeth worried she had overstepped. But then he nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. I think Dominique would have liked that, he said quietly. To be remembered, to be part of our happiness rather than its obstacle. Then she shall be Catherine Dominique Ashworth, Elizabeth decided, after both our mothers and after the brother who brought us together, even if he never knew it. Perfect, Maximilian agreed. They stood together in the nursery, the three of them, and Elizabeth thought about how strange and wonderful life could be, how love could find you in the most unexpected places, how happiness could emerge from loss, and how sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that took the longest to unfold. She had been 18 when she first met Maximilian Ashworth. She was now 25, married to him for a year and a half, and holding their child in her arms. The journey between those two moments had been long and painful and complicated beyond measure. But looking at her husband, at her daughter, at the life they had built together, Elizabeth would not change a single moment of it. Because this, right here, right now, was worth everything they had endured, every tear, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice, worth the scandal and the whispers and the judgment of society. Love, real love, was always worth the price. What are you thinking? Maximilian asked, recognizing that distant look in her eyes. I am thinking, Elizabeth said, that we should tell our daughter this story someday when she is old enough. Tell her that love does not always come easily, that sometimes you have to fight for it, wait for it, endure for it, but that when it is real, when it is true, it is worth any price. A cautionary tale? Maximilian asked with a slight smile. No, Elizabeth corrected. A love story. The greatest love story I know. Our love story, Maximilian said, pulling her closer. Our love story, Elizabeth agreed. And as the afternoon sun streamed through the nursery windows, painting everything in shades of gold, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft stood together with their daughter, living proof that love could triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. They had waited 12 years. They had loved in secret and in silence. They had sacrificed and endured and risked everything for this chance at happiness. And it had been worth every single moment. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance. The End.